The Etruscans were a culture that lived in the Italian peninsula and dominated the culture there in the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries. The Etruscans predated the Romans in terms of their rule of the Italian peninsula. And this is a culture that was very powerful due to their mining. They mined tin, iron, copper, and silver. And by the 7th century, there was this sort of wealth boom because of all of this mining and increased demand for arts and objects. So we see this sort of explosion of the creation of art objects at this time. The Etruscans controlled the city of Rome itself, so Rome was under Etruscan rule for some time under initially a king named Tarquinius Priscus. He was the first Etruscan king of Rome, and then his son and then later grandson ruled. His grandson, Tarquinius Superbus, and his sister Tullia killed their spouses so they could consolidate their power, and then they killed their father, and they took over Rome. This was a brutal, brutal murder of their father. Very famously, Tullia ran over her father in the streets of Rome with a chariot, splattering blood everywhere. Is the story. This is a lovely way to get our talk about the Etruscans started. And then her brother, Tarquinius Superbus, was driven out of Rome in 509 BC, and the Romans installed the Roman Republic, and that's, we will save for another chapter. The Etruscans existed at the same time as the Greek, Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic periods. And we're going to see a lot of similarity between the two cultures, but we will also see some significant differences. The Etruscans at this point in history were more powerful than the Greek city-states and wealthier than the Greek city-states. This object, a fibula, which is basically a brooch or a pin with its orientalizing lions, and remember Orient means Eastern, so basically we're saying Mesopotamian-style lions. And if you look at these lions here, you can see the influence of Babylon, which would have been a prominent culture at this time. These are very similar to the lions we saw on the Ishtar gates. So these Mediterranean cultures and these Near Eastern cultures are in close proximity to each other and communicating and exchanging ideas and exchanging goods. And so we see that influence here. This is made using a technique called repoussé, which is the hammering of metal, which is something that we saw in Mycenaean art with the Mask of Agamemnon. But here we also see another technique that we haven't studied before called granulation. And granulation is a kind of soldering, really, where you take beads of a metal and drop it onto the surface of a metal object, creating these raised areas. And so that's how these figures were made. But the high quality of the craftsmanship and the materials tell us that this was a wealthy and powerful culture, at least at this time. Etruscan culture was very similar to Greek culture in many, many ways, religiously especially. The Greek gods and Etruscan gods are very similar. They have slightly different names, but their religious practices and beliefs were very similar. However, there are significant differences in their temples as well as similarities. This is a typical Etruscan temple, and you can see, I think, the Greek influence. We have the pitched roof, we have a pediment, we have what appear to be Doric-style columns. However, this is not a peripteral or a peristyle structure, meaning there is not a colonnade surrounding the building as we would have seen in Greek structures. Also, Etruscan structures often sat on a platform that you're not seeing here that Greek temples did not, and I don't mean just this simple stylobate here. The columns themselves are actually what we call a Tuscan column. Tuscany, of course, is a place in Italy now, and it is what used to be Etruria, or the Etruscan realm. So Etruscan, Tuscan, you can see how the names sort of morphed into each other. My apologies. So this is actually called the Tuscan style. These columns are made with wood, as opposed to the Greek Doric columns, which would have been made with marble. In fact, the materials built to this are primarily wood. This entire temple are primarily wood and terracotta, so that is a significant difference between Greek and Etruscan art, are the materials. Greeks were using marble by the Archaic period. The Etruscans were still using wood and terracotta, which is a form of clay, which the Greeks would have used earlier. Also, you'll notice that there is no relief sculpture in any metopes or triglyphs, because there are no metopes between the triglyphs, because there are no triglyphs. There are no friezes whatsoever on these Etruscan temples, and so instead statuary was placed on top, so we would have images of the gods kind of perched on the roofs of these buildings. My apologies, I had to record this twice because I forgot to hit record on the microphone the first time I did this. This is a typical Etruscan sculpture. You can see the similarities with the Greek archaic sculpture. They both have those archaic faces with the bulging eyes and that archaic smile. There is also a similarity in the anatomy. Both the Greeks and the Etruscans were close observers of human anatomy, but there are some key differences. So first of all, the material. Our Greek sculpture is a marble sculpture, and the Etruscan is terracotta, so this low-fired clay. Also, the position of the bodies are very different. On the Greek sculpture in the Archaic period, we still see this strong Egyptian influence, with the left foot sticking straight out and the body rigid with the arms at the side, and this bilateral symmetry. So it's basically the same on either side except for the left foot sticking out. The Etruscans had a very different approach to the human form. They wanted their bodies to move, and so there's a liveliness and a life like quality, a naturalism, if you will, to the Etruscan sculpture. This statue leans forward, as one does when we're walking, right? This is how people move. We lean forward. So gone is that sort of rigid, weird Egyptian hokey pokey, and instead we see a real sort of thrust forward with the Etruscan sculpture. We also see the addition of a base at the bottom to support the sculpture, much like in the marble copies of Greek originals that we have studied before. Otherwise, there's very similarities in the hairstyle. Also, a huge difference. The Etruscan sculpture is clothed, as was the norm for most cultures in this area at the time, with the exceptions of the Greeks, because the Greeks loved that human body. Etruscans also had different burial practices than the Greeks. Etruscans often buried their dead in very elaborate tombs, whereas Greeks never really did this. This is something more in common with Egyptian culture. So even though the Etruscans had similar religious beliefs to the Greeks and similar gods and other similar religious practices, their burial practices were very different. The wealthy Etruscans buried their dead in these tumuli, these large tombs that are very similar to a tholos from Mycenaean culture, those beehive tombs that we studied, with the key difference that these are sort of sitting above. These aren't covered in dirt, or at least not the entire structures are covered in dirt. You can clearly see the sides of the buildings here. These are large. These are 130 feet or so in diameter and 50 feet tall. So you're looking at large structures. Inside, let's see what we find. Well, this is a sarcophagus, a structure that holds a coffin. We've seen sarcophagi dating all the way back to ancient Egypt and the before. This you see an Etruscan couple lounging, having dinner. This would have been a common sight for dinner in Etruscan homes where you lounged while you ate. You would have people over, you would talk, and you would conversate. This is what is happening here. You can see the motion of the woman's hands and the man's hands as if they are engaged in conversation. You can see those archaic faces, but in many ways there is a liveliness and a casualness to the bodies that the Greeks would have never really embraced, especially in this archaic period where sculptures tend to look rather stiff. One of the key differences, though, is the way the female form is treated. Actually, not the female form, but the way the woman is treated here socially. Greeks would have never allowed this kind of thing to happen. Greek men and women often lived very separate and segregated lives. Women weren't given a lot of power in ancient Greek culture. It was very much a male-dominated society, and the Greeks were horrified by the way Etruscan women had a certain amount of power. Now, certainly we're not looking at a pure equality here, but like in Egypt, we often see women alongside men and conversing with men in a way that would not have been allowed in Greek society. And Etruscans were sort of notorious in Greek eyes for the vocality of their women and letting and how women spoke their minds in the Etruscan culture. And this kind of goes back to my story about the daughter of the king who kills him in this horrific way, but it sort of shows the boldness of Etruscan women. Now, not all Etruscan women were committing patricide, so, wipe that from your mind, but certainly there is a different social dynamic. The Greek Theopompus talks about how horrified he was, though, by the way Etruscan men just allowed their women to express opinions and talk to people freely, and how they could go to dinner with their men, and how they could attend sporting events, and even how wives were honored along with husbands when children were given awards. So like if a soldier was rewarded for his bravery, and both of his parents would be mentioned in that honorary and that honoring of the soldier. Okay, so that's good for that. So let's look inside the rest of some of these tombs. There's a volcanic rock that's prevalent through large parts of Italy called tufa, Tufa, and that is what makes up the rock here. It's also what we're going to find under the surface of Rome. Tufa is fairly easy to carve, and so these tombs of these elite Etruscans who were very wealthy and powerful because of metal mining were quite elaborate. But whereas like their Egyptian counterparts, the Etruscans believed the afterlife was very similar to this life, and you had to prepare for it and you had to pack for it. The Egyptians treated their tombs in many ways sort of like storerooms, where you would kind of store your goods and then you could use that stuff later in the afterlife. But the Etruscan tombs, at least for the very wealthy, were like homes. They were decorated, they had furniture, they had beds, they had kitchens, they had all the kinds of things you would want in a home. And many of these, the furniture and the decorations were made from either carving the tufa or made by adding terracotta, wet clay, and then letting it dry to the surface. You can see by the plan on the right that this is laid out just like a home, that we have a sort of a living room with chairs. We have bedrooms with beds. So this is home sweet home for the dead. Another interior. This is called the Tomb of the Reliefs. These are from a place called Cerveteri in Italy. This is about, I don't know, 40, 50 miles or so from Rome. Here you can see that the domestic world is displayed with a lot of detail in this image. We see carvings and terracotta editions of all sorts of kinds of stuff you would find in a home, cooking implements, pitchers, tools, those sorts of things. We also even see a little house cat down here. Over back here against a bench, and I have a blow up here for you, is an image of the dog. The mythical dog Cerberus, who is the three-headed dog, you might remember this from Harry Potter, who guards the gates of the afterlife. So once again, an allusion to a religious belief that is common in both Greek and Etruscan belief. This is from the interior of this is from the tomb of the Leopards. This is a fresco. Frescoes we have seen in this area dating all the way back to the ancient Minoans. The Greeks in the Archaic period would not have had these kinds of frescoes, though. So this is an example where the Etruscans had a technology and an artistic ability that the Greeks didn't have at this time. The Greeks didn't have the resources or the know-how to do something like this in the Archaic. They would soon surpass their Etruscan neighbors, but this you wouldn't see this kind of decoration at this period in ancient Greece. This is called the Tomb of the Leopards because of this pediment area, which depicts two leopards in this heraldic stance that we have seen dating all the way back thousands of years at this point to the ancient Mesopotamians. But once again, look at sort of the liveliness of the figures here. You'll notice also that we see men and women, men portrayed with dark skin, women with light skin. So this is a artistic device that we have seen dating all the way back to the ancient Minoans. So, at this point, this is a 800, 900 plus year technique. We can see, and once again, there's that liveliness. The figures are gesturing and sort of really talking with their hands here. If we look at this particular fresco from Turkey Nia, this is from the tomb of the augur. You'll notice there's two guys standing on either side of the door, two attendants with their hands in what would have been seen as a common greeting, with their heads on their hands on their heads. If we look to the right, we can see two wrestlers, nude wrestling, just like the Greek athletes performed in the nude, so did the Etruscans. So we have kind of a sporting events all along this particular wall. With the exception in the far left, we see this is an image of the dead. This is an augur. This is a priest. We can tell by his curved staff. And down here we see a person wearing black. This is a mourner who is mourning the death of this guy here. On the far right of this image, we see something rather disturbing. We see a guard with a man who is bound by ropes, whose head is covered with a cloth, who is being mauled by a dog. This was part of a blood sport. The Etruscans, like later on the Romans do, loved to witness gladiatorial combat. They loved to see men fight animals, men fight each other, to the point that blood was drawn, and that is what you are seeing here. This man is having to fight this animal. He has a club, but he also can't see the animal. So it is a rather horrific, barbaric image. And then, once again, here's some more... Here are some more frescoes, once again, of men and women side by side, which was something we would have never seen in Greek culture at all. But there's that sort of liveliness. I also hope you notice that some of the motifs, the waves down here, the pigmentation, the coloring is very similar to Minoan art, even though Minoan culture is, 1,000 years past at this point. So there are some similarities, though. The Etruscans would have been familiar with some of the Minoan ruins at this point and would have maybe utilized some of the styles that they saw there. There's an interest in nature in a lot of Etruscan art, and images of flora and fauna, birds and animals and plants, I should say, and once again those brightly colored imagery. Etruscans were not only master sculptors when it came to using terracotta, but also with metalworking, and in fact, they were quite advanced in terms of their metal smithing and metalworking, and rivaled the Greeks at this point. This is a sculpture from depicting the founding of Rome, the mythological founding of Rome. This is a creature known as the Capitoline Wolf, named after the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Underneath are Romulus and Remus, the mythological founders of Rome, two boys who were abandoned and then left on the hill to be raised by this wolf. These sculptures of the babies here would not have been originally there, so I'm going to block them out, because those were added a long time later, 2,000 years later, during the Italian Renaissance. So we'll erase those, and we'll just focus on the wolf. The story is Romulus and Remus were raised by this wolf. Romulus kills Remus and becomes the first leader of Rome. This wolf is beautiful, I think. This is one of my favorite sculptures from this entire course. Here we can see the Etruscan, their mastery of the lost wax technique, which the Greeks also utilized. But I think also we see a sense of liveliness, a sense of sort of emotion, a kind of spark, if you will, that we don't necessarily see in Greek art, especially at this period where we're looking at sort of the very, very late Archaic. The Greeks just didn't put this kind of emotion in their work. They didn't put this sort of realism or verism, V-E-R-I-S-M, which means truthfulness, in their work. And it's sort of a weird combination of realism and abstraction or stylization. To stylize something means to sort of make it unrealistic, to make it look more decorative. And so what we're seeing here is this Capitoline Wolf. We can see there's a lot of detail paid in attention to her ribs and to the fact that she's nursing and that she's a mom. This incredibly realistic face. I don't know if you've ever seen a dog or a wolf's face. Of course you have. Dogs and wolves. They're these wolves. They're these four-legged animals. And at least dogs are everywhere. Maybe you've seen one. I sure hope you have. Here's one. And if you look at its face, it's like the artist has spent a long time looking at dogs and capturing their emotion, capturing their facial expressions, capturing the way they pant, the way the corners of their mouths sort of round and turn downwards. It's exquisite observation and craftsmanship. But then there's other places where reality has kind of been thrown out the window, and we see this very stylized fur around its haunches and around its neck that is not realistic at all. And it's not because the artist couldn't, obviously, make realistic looking image, but because they wanted this kind of stylization there, because they liked it. But there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of desperation almost in this dog's face that I think is just absolutely exquisite, and like nothing we would ever see, at least in this period, in Greek archaic art. If we look at another bronze sculpture, this is from the classical period. So we're dealing with something that's a little more realistic, but we still see some of that stylization. This is a chimera. Chimeras were from Greek mythology. They're these creatures that are made up of lions and snakes and serpents and goats. And there are these fierce beasts that are kind of represent sort of this unnatural coming together of these animals. And so once again we have that close observation, we have this incredible bronze work, once again lost wax technique. We see the musculature of the lion underneath, the way it leans forward and kind of braces itself with its haunches. We see these wrinkles in its nose. It would have had originally eyes and teeth made either from ivory or perhaps seashell, or maybe some other material, perhaps wood. We don't really know. It's long gone. So it wouldn't have looked hollow like it does now. But then we see that stylization with the fur around its mane and along its back. This is an object called a cista. These are commonly found in Etruscan tombs of the wealthy, which once again refers to sort of the wealth and power that these Etruscans had. These cistas held women's toiletries, so combs and makeup and things like that. Here at the top we see three figures. You can clearly see the Greek contrapposto technique. So once again, this is showing us that there is contact between the cultures. We have the artist has carved in their name, so Novios Plautius is the artist here, and we also know that it was a gift from a woman named Dindia Malconia to her daughter. So if you look at the detail, sort of the incising here, the scraping into the metal, this is really quite an exquisite object. This was made from a solid sheet of metal of bronze and then turned into a cylinder, kind of rolled. The Etruscans, in some of their architecture, utilized the arch. This is a architectural element we will see a lot in Rome, and was established by the Etruscans. This is from a wall guarding a city called Perugia. This city, Etruscan cities were eventually taken over by the Romans and taken into the Roman Empire. And most of the Etruscan cities were seriously damaged in the process of the Romans conquering the Etruscans. But Perugia made a deal with Rome, and so some of their buildings survived, and the walls around their cities survived. And so we'll be talking about the arch in more detail later on. This is sort of at the end of the Etruscan era. This is you're looking at a Hellenistic sculpture. And so like Greek Hellenistic sculpture, you're looking at emotion, you're looking at images of sorrow, which was a not uncommon theme of Greek Hellenistic art. So we're seeing something very similar. This is another sarcophagus, but gone is the animated and almost happy looking couple. Instead we see this despondent, sad man, Lars Poulena, staring out sort of into space. If you look at the bottom of the sarcophagus, you can see this rather gruesome view of death. We see these two figures called charons, these demon-like figures with their heavy hammers as they go to torture and pulverize this figure here, who I assume is Lars Poulena. And then on either side we see what are known as vanths, which are also demons, but female demons, from the Etruscan view of the afterlife. So we certainly see those Hellenistic tendencies which we saw in Greek art, emotion, oftentimes negative emotions, playing out here. And these sarcophagus lids give us a good idea of what Etruscan life was like. And once again, we see that Etruscan realism or verism in this image of this couple. A lot of care has been taken to show their sort of love for each other. We see a kind of interaction, a romantic interaction here that we don't see in Greek art. There's something very sort of sweet about the way this couple embraces each other in death. And then you also see there's a very fine detail in portraying the sheets over their bodies. This is stone, and yet we see the outline of their bodies underneath the sheet as if it is made of linen or some other sort of we're going to round this out with an image of a magistrate, a guy named Ole Metele. He is a civic leader. By this time, the Etruscans were fully conquered by the Romans, and their style of dress, their style of clothing, or their hairstyles were very Roman in nature. In fact, this statue looks very Roman. We'll see a lot of statues of orators like this with their hand up in the air addressing their people. Like the other statues, bronze statues we have seen, he is missing the inlays of his eyes. But we see that realism here that we have seen throughout Etruscan art. And that wraps up our chapter on the Etruscans. So we're going to move on now to Rome. So we'll see you there.